A wall of mud and debris tore through the Arizona desert today. Some folks had to jump out of its path and barely escape.
A wall of mud and debris tore through the Arizona desert, but beneath the chaos was a river with an even more remarkable story. Fossil Creek is one of the last places you would expect to find water this clear, this blue, and this powerful. Deep inside central Arizona, a spring-fed river cuts through a canyon of red rock, creating turquoise pools that look almost tropical. Yet for most of the 20th century, that river was barely a river at all. For 96 years, almost the entire flow of Fossil Creek was taken from its natural channel and sent through hydroelectric turbines. The creek that once carried about 20,000 gallons of water every minute was reduced to a thin, struggling stream. Its pools warmed. Algae spread. Native fish nearly disappeared. Even the strange process that made Fossil Creek famous began to stop. Because Fossil Creek does something extraordinary. Its water is rich in dissolved calcium. Wherever the current slows, that calcium leaves the water and hardens into limestone called travertine. Leaves and branches become sealed inside stone. Small ledges grow into terraces. Pools form behind those terraces, and the river slowly builds its own staircase through the canyon. Around 13 tons of fresh travertine can be deposited along Fossil Creek every day. That makes this river an active, self-building landscape, constantly creating new stone. But that process requires something simple: water moving through the canyon. The source of that water is equally unusual. Fossil Creek is powered by springs rather than seasonal snowmelt. Around 20,000 gallons emerge every minute, at roughly 70 to 72 degrees Fahrenheit, year after year. In a desert where streams can shrink into dry washes during summer, Fossil Creek keeps flowing. That dependable water created a remarkable green corridor. Cottonwood, sycamore, willow, ash, and other trees line the banks. More than 100 bird species use the area. The canyon became a refuge of life surrounded by an environment defined by heat, stone, and scarcity. Then people realized the water could do more than support an ecosystem. It could make electricity. In 1900, a rancher named Lou Turner claimed the creek. Soon afterward, the springs and headwaters were claimed as well. At the time, central Arizona was growing rapidly. Mining towns needed electricity, and a powerful spring dropping through a canyon with enormous elevation difference looked less like a natural wonder and more like an untouched battery. The project that followed was astonishing. The nearest railroad stop was more than 40 miles away, across rugged country without a proper road. Before engineers could build the power plant, workers had to create a route into the canyon. More than 400 mules and 600 men helped move equipment through terrain that was steep, hot, and dangerous. Heavy machinery, cement, generators, and turbines had to be transported into a canyon dropping roughly 1,600 feet from the rim. Loads were lowered with ropes and block-and-tackle systems. Men and animals worked in extreme heat. Some died from falls, accidents, or heat exposure. The effort eventually produced Childs Power Plant, which began operating on June 21, 1909. A second plant, Irving, followed several years later. To feed the turbines, engineers built roughly 8,800 feet of flumes along the canyon walls and constructed a 25-foot dam near the springs. The result transformed Phoenix. By 1920, the Childs and Irving plants together supplied roughly 70% of the city's electricity. Streetlights, streetcars, and early air conditioning systems depended on power generated by water that began its journey in this remote canyon. But while Phoenix was becoming modern, Fossil Creek was becoming something else entirely. Below the dam, the streambed remained enormous, because it had been shaped by a full river for thousands of years. Yet the water flowing through it had been reduced to a fraction of its natural volume. It was like leaving a garden hose inside the empty channel of a river. The consequences appeared slowly, then everywhere. Deep, moving water stays relatively cool. Shallow, slow water heats quickly. Pools that had once remained clear and cool began warming during the day. Algae grew more easily. Water that had once been brilliantly turquoise became green. Silt settled into places where a stronger current would have carried it away. The travertine factory stopped working. Without sufficient flow, new limestone deposits could no longer form at their normal rate. Existing ledges dried and cracked. A river that had built approximately 13 tons of stone each day became a ghost of itself. Then came the fish. Fossil Creek's native species had evolved around its unusual conditions: steady flow, stable temperature, mineral-rich water, and travertine pools. When the habitat shrank, the fish were forced into smaller spaces. Crowding increased. Spawning became harder. Disease and predation became greater threats. Meanwhile, non-native fish had entered the watershed. They were comfortable in the warmer, altered conditions created by the diversion. They competed with native species for food and habitat, and they preyed on them. For nearly a century, the creek remained trapped in this condition. Then the economics changed. By the 1990s, the hydroelectric plants were old, and the electricity they produced was tiny compared with the needs of modern Phoenix. The plants that had once powered most of the city had become a small part of a much larger electrical system. Relicensing aging infrastructure in a remote canyon would require expensive upgrades, environmental reviews, and mitigation. The financial argument that had once justified taking Fossil Creek's water was disappearing. In 1999, Arizona Public Service agreed to decommission both plants and return the creek's full flow to its natural channel. It was an extraordinary decision. No court forced the company to do it. The utility voluntarily surrendered roughly 20,000 gallons of water every minute. But giving the water back was only the beginning. Researchers knew the creek could not simply be switched on and expected to heal itself instantly. The non-native fish were still there. If full flow returned while the invaders remained, the restoration could create an even better habitat for the species that had helped destroy the native community. So the first step was not opening the dam. It was removing the invaders. And what happened next would become one of the most remarkable river restoration stories in America. But the story was never as simple as electricity versus nature. The canyon had a human history long before the power plants appeared. Archaeological evidence suggests people have lived in the watershed for thousands of years, and Yavapai and Apache communities regard this country as ancestral ground. The workers who later hauled industrial equipment into the canyon included Apache and Mojave men. The same landscape therefore carried several histories at once: a homeland, a source of water, an industrial site, and eventually a restoration laboratory. That complexity matters because Fossil Creek was not an untouched wilderness waiting for modern people to discover it. It was a place people had used, traveled through, depended upon, and changed. The hydroelectric project did not emerge from nowhere. It was part of the larger story of the American Southwest, where water was repeatedly treated as something that could be redirected, measured, purchased, and turned into economic power. For Phoenix, the decision made sense in its own era. A growing city needed electricity, and Fossil Creek offered dependable energy when dependable energy was extraordinarily difficult to produce. The canyon's water helped make modern life in the desert possible. Yet the same decision also created a hidden cost that remained almost invisible for generations. That is what makes the later restoration so compelling. The project was not simply a battle between good people and bad people. It was a change in priorities. What had once been valuable because it could power machines became valuable because it could support an ecosystem. The river itself had not changed its purpose. Human beings had changed what they were willing to value. And when the water finally returned, the canyon became a place where those two eras could be seen at once: the old flumes and concrete structures above, and below them, a living river beginning to rebuild the landscape. For decades, almost nobody could see that hidden cost from the city. Electricity is immediate and measurable. A functioning river is quieter. Its value appears in fish that survive, birds that nest, plants that grow, and stone that slowly forms beneath moving water. Those benefits do not arrive on a monthly power bill, but losing them changes an entire ecosystem. That is why the researchers were so interested in the creek. Fossil Creek gave them a rare chance to watch a damaged river respond when its most important missing ingredient returned. The canyon was about to reveal whether a river could recover from nearly a century of starvation. And the answer would not arrive through a speech or a photograph. It would arrive through measurements, fish counts, chemistry, and the sound of water moving where water had been missing. And nobody looked away. In the fall of 2004, nearly 100 people entered the Fossil Creek Canyon. Forest Service crews, Arizona game and fish biologists, university researchers, and volunteers worked together in a place where there were no easy roads, no convenient equipment sheds, and no simple way out. They worked directly in the creek, moving upstream section by section. Fish were captured, identified, and sorted. Native species were protected. Non-native fish were removed. The work was exhausting because every net, tool, and piece of equipment had to reach the canyon by foot, pack animal, or helicopter. Then came the second line of defense. A barrier was constructed to prevent invasive fish from simply swimming back into the restored habitat. The logic was straightforward: remove what did not belong, block its return, and only then restore the water. By the following spring, the invaders had been cleared from the critical reaches, the barrier was functioning, and researchers had instruments ready to record what happened next. 4 years, scientists had been studying the starved creek. They measured water chemistry, nutrient processing, photosynthesis, fish populations, and travertine deposition. They also had something incredibly valuable: a healthy reference reach upstream that had never been dewatered. That meant Fossil Creek could become more than a restoration project. It could become a natural experiment. On June 18, 2005, Arizona Public Service shut off the flume. For the first time since 1909, the full flow of Fossil Springs was allowed to travel through its original canyon. There was no dramatic wall of water. 20,000 gallons a minute sounds enormous, but spread across a wide streambed that had been waiting for almost a century, the returning water moved surprisingly slowly. It crept into old channels. It slipped between boulders. It soaked into dry gravel and emerged farther downstream. Side channels that had been dry for generations began filling. Warm pools received cool water at one end and pushed stagnant water out the other. Scientists walked beside the advancing flow. They had expected recovery to take decades, perhaps an entire generation. That seemed reasonable. The creek had been altered for 96 years. Surely nature would need a similar amount of time to rebuild itself. But the measurements began telling a different story. Within a single season, photosynthesis increased. The creek's ability to process nutrients returned toward the levels found in the healthy upstream reach. Core ecosystem functions that had been suppressed for decades responded rapidly once the water returned. The river had not forgotten how to function. It had been waiting. That distinction changed the meaning of the entire project. Fossil Creek showed that some environmental damage is not necessarily permanent. When the underlying system remains intact, removing the pressure can allow recovery to happen far faster than expected. Then the travertine began returning. The same water chemistry that had built Fossil Creek's famous terraces before the diversion started working again. New deposits formed along the stream. Some travertine dams grew more than 2 centimeters per year. Pools deepened behind them. The creek began rebuilding its own architecture. Nobody had to manufacture those terraces. Nobody had to design every pool. The river simply resumed a process that had been interrupted. But the fish provided the most dramatic evidence. With invasive species removed, the barrier holding, and full flow restored, native fish populations expanded rapidly. Sonora suckers increased roughly 17-fold. Desert suckers climbed around 52-fold. Round-tail chub, once dangerously close to disappearing locally, increased about 70-fold. And the speckled dace produced perhaps the most astonishing number of all. Its population increased on the order of 150-fold. These fish had not been replaced by a hatchery. They had not been artificially manufactured into existence. Survivors were breeding into habitat that suddenly offered cooler water, stable conditions, restored pools, and freedom from invasive competitors. Today, Fossil Creek supports 9 native fish species and represents an extraordinary achievement in Arizona conservation. It became the longest river reach in the state where the native fish community is completely free of non-native species. The recovery also extended beyond the water. The restored corridor supports roughly 200 species of birds, mammals, reptiles, and amphibians. Around the springs, researchers have documented 166 plant species. But success created a new danger. People discovered Fossil Creek. Turquoise water in the middle of the Arizona desert is almost impossible to resist. Thousands of visitors began arriving. The narrow access road became congested. Vehicles lined the roadside. Emergency access became difficult. Banks were trampled. Trash accumulated. Human waste threatened water quality. The creek had survived 96 years of industrial diversion, only to face a different kind of pressure: admiration. In 2009, Congress designated nearly 17 miles of Fossil Creek as a wild and scenic river. Protection helped, but it did not eliminate the problem of too many visitors. The Forest Service eventually introduced a permit system. Access during busy periods became reservation-based, parking was controlled, roadside parking was prohibited, and camping was restricted. It may sound inconvenient, but the reason is simple. A restored ecosystem can still be damaged by the people who come to admire it. And Fossil Creek's deeper lesson reaches far beyond Arizona. The story is not simply about removing a dam. It is about understanding what happens when a river is given back the thing it needs most. The sequence mattered. First, invasive fish had to be removed. Then a barrier had to protect the native community. Only afterward could the full flow return. The economics mattered too. The moral argument for restoration existed for decades, but the financial reality eventually made continued operation difficult. The old plants produced little power, while maintaining and relicensing them would cost much more. And the springs themselves never cared about any of that. For thousands of years, they had produced the same steady flow. They continued through the hydroelectric era, the restoration, the scientific experiments, and the debates over cost. 20,000 gallons a minute. Roughly 70 to 72 degrees. Water turning into stone. The human contribution was surprisingly small. People removed invasive fish, built a barrier, closed the flume, and stepped aside. Then the river did what it had always known how to do. Water returned to old channels. Travertine began growing again. Pools deepened. Native fish multiplied. Plants and wildlife returned. The most powerful part of the Fossil Creek story is not that humans rebuilt a river. It is that, once the pressure was removed, the river rebuilt much of itself. At the canyon rim, Vincent Randall, a Yavapai Apache tribal historian and councilman, spoke about the complicated history surrounding the dam and the people who had helped build it. His words carried the weight of generations. The project had once represented achievement, labor, electricity, and progress. But its time had passed. He asked the creek for forgiveness. And perhaps the river's answer was visible rather than verbal. It flowed. It built stone. It carried life. A creek that had been reduced to a shadow for 96 years began acting like itself again. Fossil Creek does not promise that every damaged river can recover this quickly. Some losses are permanent. Extinction cannot simply be reversed. Every ecosystem is different. But Fossil Creek proves something important. When the source remains healthy and the destructive pressure can be removed, nature may recover with astonishing speed. Sometimes restoration does not mean rebuilding everything from scratch. Sometimes it means stopping what we are doing long enough for the river to remember what it was. And perhaps that is the most remarkable lesson Fossil Creek has to offer. A river does not always need us to save it. Sometimes, it only needs us to stop taking it away. There is a warning in that success. Fossil Creek's recovery depended on unusually favorable circumstances. The springs remained intact. The water continued arriving at a dependable temperature and volume. Native fish survived long enough to reproduce. Scientists had a healthy reference reach for comparison. And, crucially, people were willing to remove the invasive species before restoring the flow. Those conditions will not exist everywhere. Still, the lesson is powerful because so many rivers are altered by the same basic pressure. Water is removed, redirected, or stored until the river downstream becomes something smaller than the landscape that created it. Fossil Creek shows what can happen when that pressure is reversed. It also shows why restoration is not a single moment. The valve closure was dramatic, but the work continued afterward. Scientists kept measuring. Managers had to protect the fish. Visitors had to be controlled. The ecosystem had to be watched as it adjusted. That is the part of environmental recovery that rarely makes headlines. Nature may respond quickly, but protecting that response requires patience. And perhaps that is why Fossil Creek remains so extraordinary. It is not only a story about a river returning. It is a story about recognizing when an old idea has reached its end, accepting the cost of changing course, and allowing a natural system to take over again.